speaker. So the last speaker is Bryan Watters, who was a career soldier and has been an academic at Shrivenham, the Academy for Cranfield University since that time. And Bryan's talking about British Army leadership. The leader says, come on, while the commander says, go on. Commanders are not leaders. Bryan.
Thank you very much, Keith. And thank you, Jeffrey, for that last talk as well. I hope we can have a conversation later. As Keith said, I was a career soldier until 12 years ago when I went over to the dark side of academia. I commanded in the army. I was an infantry officer and I commanded in every rank from second lieutenant to brigadier on operations. And one of the things that's always worried me when I've reflected back on it was encapsulated at the Staff College in 2001 by a visiting lecturer called General Rupert Smith, who at the time was Deputy Supreme Commander Allied Forces Europe. And I'd worked for him for 2 years as an operational commander. He was my boss in Northern Ireland for 2 years when I was a battalion commander, and I was greatly inspired by him. And so when I was at Staff College as the writing team leader for the Command and Leadership syllabus of the Advanced Command and Staff course, I invited Rupert to come along and talk about leadership, thinking it would be outstanding and I would bask in the reflected glory of having brought in a superb speaker. So as the sponsor of the speaker, you're sitting beside the commandant, and Rupert Smith began by saying the leader says come on, and sort of gestured, and the commander says go on. Commanders are not leaders. And the commandant, who's a Royal Air Force officer, in a very loud whisper said in my ear, of course commanders are leaders, and glowered at me. And what's this lunatic talking about? And I just begged him to bear with the general, because the general was provoking us to think, because Rupert Smith provoked one to think. And it made me think. And later on, when I went to work in the Defence Leadership Centre and we were required to write defence leadership doctrine in a pamphlet called Leadership in Defence, which is currently undergoing its 2nd edition writing, we were asked by the sponsor of the doctrine, the Vice Chief of Defence Staff, to encapsulate this idea of command and leadership, and indeed management. And so we did. And Rupert Smith sort of set the conditions for us to think. And so, what is command? We began by thinking. So as a military commander, do you lead followers or simply exercise authority to direct subordinates, to go on, as Rupert Smith said? So the two functions of command and leadership can indeed be conflated, and we all sitting around the table as a think tank all reflected on when we indeed had conflated the two, and we'd thought we were leading when in fact we were commanding. I tell people what to do and they do it. What's the difficulty of that? I'm a leader. So command, though, in a military sense, is a very precise term, and its meaning and interpretation is enshrined in doctrine, regulations and law. And doctrine is that what is taught, that's what is stated, sometimes described as the body of professional knowledge of the military. And in my paper, I do note that Erwin Rommel commented that the British write some of the best doctrine in the world, and we're very fortunate, he said, as a German, that British officers don't read it. And maybe that is still the case today, maybe less so. So command, as in the doctrine in ADP operations, is described as the process by which commanders make decisions, impress their will on and transmit their intentions to subordinates. And whenever doctrine talks about command, those below the commander are termed subordinates, not followers. Also, commanders are required to maintain good order and discipline, and that's explained in the Manual of Military Law. And military discipline is a behaviour that through training and indoctrination ensures subordinates follow orders, and that maintains military cohesion under pressure. That's the theory. And the requirement of a commander in law is to maintain operational effectiveness and efficiency of the army. And if you fail to do that, you will be relieved of command because you have failed as a commander. It doesn't mention anything about leading. But what about this commanders and leadership? So commanders, the doctrine states, are required to be strong leaders capable of adapting their leadership style to the requirements of the operation and force. Different circumstances demand varying degrees of regulation, delegation, inspiration, and coercion. And that again is stated as the rules, the doctrine. In 2021, the British Army produced a new leadership doctrine authored by the Centre for Army Leadership under the banner Future Soldier, New Doctrine for a New Generation of Leaders. It replaced a doctrine written in 2016. And this new doctrine defines leadership as a combination of character, knowledge, and action that inspires others to succeed. So this new Army doctrine, building on the Leadership Code of 2016, explains the attributes an Army leader is expected to have. And it lists these attributes as knowledge, skills, and behaviours. It states these are quite difficult to explain in all circumstances. It says it's not easy. Some of the most prominent ones they describe are humility, emotional intelligence, the ability to know your people, mental agility, confidence, robustness, and a sense of humour. The only new one, in my experience, is emotional intelligence. I look forward to the weaponising of emotional intelligence. Army leadership styles, the new doctrine states that there are a number of styles: directive, pace-setting, participative, coaching, affiliative, and visionary. The directive style, it cautions, it contains a warning. It says it is dangerously easy to fall back on in less demanding circumstances, and overuse can have a negative impact. I would slightly challenge that. I think it's easy to fall back on in challenging circumstances as well as non-challenging circumstances. And I've used some theoretical frameworks in the paper, should you wish to read it, to break this down. And so I've looked at sort of transactional behaviour, which I align to command, going back to Weber's sort of rational legal authority and traditional authority, and then Burns and Bass's ideas of transforming and transformational leadership, contingent reward and so on. And then the transformational I align to leadership in the paper, which goes again back to Weber's charismatic authority, and then Bernard Bass's ideas of idealized influence and so on. I was then in conversation with a lieutenant general not long ago, actually, and we were discussing what he considered his style of leadership. And he is he's one of 13 lieutenant generals in the army. They're the second highest rank. And this is what he said. Now, I was brutally honest with myself. My style, I've learned that I get better outcomes, better results by being, I think the doctrine will be transformational, by using those skills of humility, empathy, and emotional intelligence rather than transactional. It is easy to be transactional. Quite interesting that he talks about those qualities, if you will, as skills rather than behaviours or whatever. But anyway, I think one of the weaknesses in the British military, and maybe why we are seeing, in my humble opinion, some of the pretty bad behaviour that we are seeing, particularly from senior leaders, is that if you've got a badge, a big badge and a uniform in your own office with a brass plaque on the door, and people kind of call you sir all day, it's quite easy to forget to lead and just have an assumption that just because you put on a uniform in the morning and it's got a badge on it and people call you sir, that means by default you don't have to do anything to lead, and at best you're just managing, right? And sometimes one of the lessons I've learned the hard way is sometimes I fell into that trap, and I would agree with the Lieutenant General. I think most commanders, including myself, have fallen into that trap of commanding, not leading. And command is effortless and leadership is quite effortful, and maybe that's got something to do with it. So with this big badge, then, it's quite easy to forget to lead. And the paper argues that the internal processes, notably positional power that is legally enforced, enables transactional leadership as a baseline or default style of leadership. It is the default style. It is the command style. Equally, Kunnert and Lewis's argument that transactional and transformation leaders are different sorts of people has resonance with military leadership, but the paper argues that command, while requiring leadership, doctrinally, commanders are required to exercise leadership. So while requiring leadership, provides a seductive alternative to transformational leadership, as it's quite easy to forget to lead. I used a series of theoretical frameworks, and I'm sure they're familiar to most people listening. Agrias and Jean, where we're talking about theories espoused and theories in use. And I think, again, that's also a very useful way to think about command and leadership. So theories in use are those, as Grice and Sean explained, are those mental maps, beliefs, assumptions that subconsciously guide people's actions. They're effortless. Whereas theories espoused, the conscious held beliefs and explanations people use to explain or justify their actions. And these are conscious, these are effortful. And so, especially in times of stress for a military leadership, I think it is quite easy to fall back to your natural theories in use, which are effortless, and forget the need to lead. And then I talked about Weber, I've explained, and Burns and Bass. Zoni, also you could use his categories of coercive and remunerative for command, and identitative for leadership, and Nye's hard and soft power. And in my paper, I do credit the fact that I first discovered these two latter academics through a paper that Keith Grint wrote. I also looked at the American and Australian perspectives. I'd spent a year as a deputy commanding general of an American joint unit, Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines, no Coast Guards, commanded by an Army Lieutenant General. And I'd read American Army doctrine, so I understood what it meant to command American servicemen. So the Army expects leaders selected to command. That's really quite different. They're not commanders who are required to lead. They are leaders who are selected to command. So the Americans position it slightly differently. Lead beyond mere exercise of formal authority. They lead by example and serve as role models. Their personal example and actions carry tremendous weight. They also state every army leader is a subordinate to someone, so all leaders are also followers. Again, that's something explicitly stated in their doctrine, which isn't in ours that I could find. My experience working with the Americans for a year was there were commanders who were not leaders, who fell in their doctrinal requirement, but I also worked for some exemplary leaders who were commanders, not least the commanding general I worked for. And then I looked at the Australians, and the Australians, if one's risking being slightly stereotypical, are a little more frank and a little more down to earth about it all. So they say command as the authority which a commander in military service lawfully exercises over subordinates by virtue of rank or assignment, and leadership, the process of influencing others in order to gain their willing consent in the ethical pursuit of missions. And in the Australian Navy doctrine, it explores commanders and leaders' relationship, providing some interesting insights. For example, people who are not leaders will on occasion be appointed to positions of command. The consequences are usually regrettable. I think that's a truism that most people who have been leaders and commanders, who've been commanded, have experienced. So to conclude, in our own defence doctrine that we wrote in 2004, we also highlighted this issue. So some commanders are poor leaders, but are able to function in the role by exercising managerial tools and positional power to get people to do the job. Their personal authority is not necessarily compromised during stable times, yet in time of crisis, their shortcoming as leaders will be exposed by their inability to draw on the trust of their people and exercise influence. And one might, drawing on experience, say, so commanders who are not leaders direct subordinates in a transactional relationship utilizing positional power. And I've seen that, and I've occasionally done it. When the sanctions or punishments used to transactionally intimidate fail to coerce, the transactional relationship breaks down. It might be a simple matter of opportunity cost from the point of view of the follower. So you, the commander, want me to capture that hill. In my judgment, the capturing of that hill will result in my colleagues, my friends, possibly being killed or injured. So no, thank you. I don't want to do that. So how are you going to compel me to do it? You can't compel people to do it when the opportunity costs are not in the favor of the commander, when they're in the favor of the subordinate. If the subordinate just refuses to do it. If you go back 100 years, you could be shot for doing that. Today, in our liberal democracy, you can't be shot. So the alternative would be possibly disgrace and maybe some time in prison. And like all military commanders, I have sent people to prison for failing to do as they're told. And they decided that rather than do as they're told, they prefer to go to prison. You've lost in many ways, and you've failed to inspire. So why would people capture the hill? The reason to capture the hill at all costs, as it in its operation imperative, will be achieved by the transformation leader through their positional power. It then becomes the follower's intent to capture the hill, because there is very little or no reward. The reward at best might be a piece of ribbon. And none of this is new. Burns, in his fantastic book, Leadership, in 1978, on page 19, wrote, "Leadership, unlike naked power wielding, is thus inseparable from followers' needs and goals." So as a commander, if you don't get your intent as that of your subordinate, who you hope to develop into a follower, then you won't get much done. Having said that, a final little story. During the Falklands War, a friend of mine was commanding a unit in the Falklands, and they came under fire from Argentinian aircraft, some Pucara. And they'd taken, on the first pass of the aircraft, they'd taken several people killed and injured. And the person responsible for protecting them from these aircraft was lying on the floor, terrified, with his hands over his helmet and his blowpipe missile by his side. And my friend went up to him and drew his pistol, stuck it in his face and said, "Get up and shoot down that aircraft." And so he presented a transactional relationship to that soldier. And the alternative appeared to be that if you don't get up, I'm going to blow your head off. The soldier did get up and shot down the Pucara and saved many lives. My friend has never been proud of that particular piece of command, but said in the moment it seemed the only thing he could do. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Brian. Great. While people think about questions, I will just ask you one, actually trying to relate to what Jeffrey was talking about. So Jeffrey was talking about the kinds of people that emerge from Sandhurst at the top, people that win the Sword of Honour and everything. In your experience, since you've had a greater exposure to more senior officers, is it the same people at the top, or do they change across time? So do the people that emerge from Sandhurst, are they changed by Sandhurst, do you think, or do you think that we end up with the same kinds of people at the very top as would have been at the top in Sandhurst?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sandhurst used to be 2 years, and when Sandhurst was 2 years, which was the intake before mine, so that was before 1972, there probably was an opportunity over 2 years taking 17 and 18-year-old young boys, as they were, to possibly change them into the sort of person the army wanted. Today, 85% of Sandhurst entrants are graduates. They already have their own sense of who they are, their sense of self, and Sandhurst has less than a year. So I don't think Sandhurst really trains them. In my experience there, as an instructor, I think most of the cadets sort of game it and play the rules in order to get through. My other experience is Sandhurst can enable the sort of sociopathic narcissist to flourish. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And the Army Officer Selection Board quite often selects them as well because they stand out as being terribly confident and capable. Having been Colonel Training at Sandhurst and the deputy at the Army Officer Selection Board, I speak with some experience of failing to select out some people. My experience is most of them, when they join the army properly, discover that sort of behaviour isn't condoned in the more junior officer positions. So they tame themselves and they present the sort of junior officer, middling ranking officer that their boss expects, because it's only their boss that reports on them. At the moment, that may be changing. And they ameliorate those behaviours, but when they become senior officers, actually there are very few constraints on them anymore, especially when they get to sort of 2, 3, 4 star, and so they can revert to being the narcissistic sociopath that they always have been, but have learnt to socially adapt in order to be acceptable. And then that goes, and I've seen it happen with several people, suddenly turn into monsters that people hadn't realised were in that sheep's clothing.
Thanks very much. Caroline, you had a question.
I'm almost frightened to ask, but Cranwell has shortened its officer training from 6 months to 5. I'm just wondering what you think the effects of that could be in terms of leadership training and in teaching our officers to be responsible, ethical and compassionate, building on what Leo's just put on the chat?
Well, I mean, I'd simply say if they arrive at the age of, say, 22, and you've got them for 5 months, I mean, what impression are you going to put on their 22-year-old sense of self and who they are, other than teaching them the rules of the game? And if they want to progress in this new place where they are clearly committed to want to be and to succeed, they will understand the rules of the game. But I don't think you will change the people, and maybe you shouldn't, having hopefully selected the sort of people you want in the first place. So I don't think you change them at all. And I don't think Sandhurst in its 11 months changes them either. And I used to sum this up to people that when I was a cadet at Sandhurst and somebody told me to jump, I would say, "How high, sir?" When I was there as an instructor, you say to somebody, "Jump," and they go, "Why? What's the point? Explain it to me, justify it," which I think is a much better position to be in for Sandhurst. But I don't think you change. I think we delude ourselves at our military academies that we actually shape and change people given the short time they spend there.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Owen.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. It's really great you submitted this paper, Brian. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm really grateful that you did. The first thing is I'm interested in who's in the background in Keith's picture, because I don't know whether you keep them under a strict command regime, occasional food and water, or not. But
it's my professional writer now. Just get on with your question.
Yeah, that's quite right. Okay, fair enough. I don't feel particularly qualified to ask directly about military leadership, but my impression reading the paper and listening to Brian's presentation is actually there's a bigger question in here for the field of leadership studies. So I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about more fundamentals about what leadership is and what that definition means in terms of how we shape research. So I've been particularly thinking around notions of technology and leadership, where I think a lot of the definition of what does being a leader and doing leadership actually mean, because it can get easily conflated with just a senior person giving instructions, which potentially has horrible consequences actually for how we start to integrate sort of digital and automated technology into our lives. And so I keep find myself going back to Keith's problems 2005 study, and I'm really grateful that you're thinking about these differentiations. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts about kind of other organizational contexts, because I mean it's quite common that we learn actually from ideas being developed in a military context elsewhere. So I'm just wondering if there was any sort of direct read over or indirect read over into other kinds of organizational contexts for this kind of differentiation you're making.
Well, I think if you look at those academic frameworks, transactional transformation, hard power, soft power, and so on. I think they exist everywhere. My brother-in-law's a banker, and he's in a distinct transactional relationship with his boss, and it's called annual bonus. And really, that's the relationship that exists to generate that for both of them. And there's very little concept of followership. They're in a sort of a joint enterprise, and he is the subordinate. And he and I often talk about it, and he just laughs that the military are able to get people to do extraordinary things for a bit of ribbon, but he wants tens of thousands of pounds to do something not half as difficult or dangerous. And so I think the military has this sort of amazing ability for people to inspire other people to take life-changing risks. And why they do it, and there's a huge amount of study gone on that, and I think that's what other people like to do. How could we get our people to do that for half the money and a bit of ribbon? So that's where the military has a position. But again, I think the military often deludes itself that it's working with this sort of autocratic style of leadership, governed by power, and it's a power that isn't replicable anywhere else, really. There aren't many other organizations where so I told Keith to do something and Keith said get stuffed, I'd then put Keith in jail for 2 weeks. That doesn't happen in other walks of life.
Yes.
So there is more of the pity. But so I think there are interesting parallels where you can say, how can we do that? How can you inspire people to do things? And Bass and Burns talked about this in their transformational leadership, which I also find fascinating. And you sometimes feel guilty about quoting papers that are quite so old or pieces of research, but I don't think they're being bettered in understanding these relationships. How do you get somebody to put aside their own selfish requirements and do something for the greater good? And that's what the military have been doing for millennia. And I think it is getting more difficult with and challenging the military with the whole concepts of artificial intelligence underpinning decision making, rather than looking into somebody's eyes and trusting them. And this is presenting the military with all sorts of issues that the sort of the DC organisation at Shrivenham are exploring as we speak. But I think it presents new challenges.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left and we have 2 questions. So Leo, do you want to put your point up?
Actually, I put a question in the text box about just the languages that are being in use here, which is interesting because over time, obviously, there's a concerted attempt to update the doctrine and update the language and the rhetoric, right? But I'm quite interested by how that happens or doesn't happen. So it's obviously very selective. So again, you've got the uniform culture, command, line staff, crown. So certain things come in, some modernizing dynamics, but not all. I was fascinated to see that the idea of compassion hasn't appeared in any of this so far, because that's kind of a very powerful leadership idea at the moment. You see it everywhere, including even in some uniform places and police, starting to see a student working on kind of compassionate leadership in the police, for example, right? It strikes me that, maybe is there some kind of a filtering effect whereby certain ideas will percolate inwards to a degree and others won't, not even rhetorically. And I just wonder, just a quick comment.
No, it's a really good point, Leah. At the moment, we're rewriting Leadership in Defence Second Edition, and I'm the lead writer, and I've got an editorial board that is very diverse, and I'm being all the time challenged about my language, as words like compassion or unintended sort of gender intonations and so on. And so the Ministry of Defence, as was talked about earlier, are trying to more reflect society. But you also have in the final analysis, it's very difficult to be a deeply compassionate person and send 5 people out to do a mission, and the likelihood is all 5 of them, or at least 3 of them, are going to be killed. It's very difficult to be compassionate and maintain your sanity. So I think there is a degree of sort of pragmatic realism that underpins the military approach.
Okay, thanks very much for that answer. Last question, Victor.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so transformational leadership assumes that leaders can transform these so-called followers, which are usually seen as a sort of passive mass of people. And in organizations with explicit power asymmetries, do you think that this transformational power is possible, or is it just another expression of how leadership cover this power asymmetry? So can I be transformed when, if I don't follow the chain of command, I can get jailed or things like that? How do we balance these two forces?
Yeah, Victor, thank you. When in defense, in the military, when you are leading and you are trying your very best to transform, and in my own personal experience, I found that was more required when I was leading international forces as part of NATO, for example, and leading Americans, different nations, also leading a joint group of people from the Air Force and the Navy, because you have less autocratic control of them. If you went to a huge amount of trouble, you probably could have them court-martialed and punished. It'd be a horrible, horrible process. Whereas when it's in your own silo, it's a default. It's too easy. And so when you're dealing with these diverse groups of people, you've got to appeal. You've got to try and transform them, to put aside their own personal and national priorities for a NATO priority. And I use the words effortful. You know, it's extremely effortful, and some people aren't necessarily capable. And one of the other issues that we haven't really talked about in crises is sleep deprivation. And when you are tired and you're existing for 10 days on 3 or 4 hours sleep a night, it's difficult to be effortful. You know, it's much easier simply to say, just do it. But when you can't say just do it, because these people say get stuffed, you know, Brit, you've then got to think, well, how do I get through to you? How do I convince you, which is very effortful. And I found, you know, I would spend ages getting things done, whereas in a simple British situation, it would have taken me 30 seconds. It took me 3 hours to convince my Swede, my Spanish, my French and my Italian that I really wanted them to do something. Technically, they all worked for me, but they didn't really. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think many military do delude themselves that they are leaders and they transform, when in fact they simply enact governance with authority.
Fab. Thank you very much, everybody. That was a great session. Thank you, Caroline, Daniela, Jeffrey, and last of all, Brian. And thanks to all the participants and some great questions. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. So it's now a break, and then 11:30 back for Jean Hartley's keynote. Thank you very much, and goodbye.